back, relax, and maybe get yourself a snack. Me and you gonna have a little chat about books. Hey guys! So I am here today to talk to you about 3 non-fiction reads that I recently picked up. I audiobooked all of these, so I would recommend the audio for all of them because that's how I consumed them, and I actually really enjoyed all of them as well. I was recommended all 3 of them on Twitter the other day because I put out a tweet saying that I wanted to kind of put up some non-fiction November reviews in November to give you ideas of what to read, and this was the result of that. I basically got 3 new books that I really enjoyed, and I'm super happy that I've now read them. So let's get started talking about them. The 3 books I want to mention are called Killers of the Flower Moon, Oil, Money, Murder and the Birth of the FBI, which is by David Grann, One Child, the Story of China's Most Radical Experiment, which is by Mei Fong, and then Into Thin Air, which is by John Krakauer. So I'm going to start off by talking about the Killers of the Flower Moon. Now this is a book that I picked up because it sounded like a really interesting premise and quite a dark story as well. And when I'm reading non-fiction, I tend to find that personally I enjoy stories that are quite dark, quite ominous and scary, or quite tragic and horrible. I don't know why, it's a fascination I have, but it is. And this story was to do with a group of people settled in America who are called the Osage Indian clan, and they were settled in America for many years, and then eventually the government tried to take their land from them and buy it off of them and separate it out into small kind of bits and pieces and sell it off to rich people. However, when they did this, they actually found out that the land that they were now on was very rich in oil, and this clan became one of the richest clans in the entirety of America. They were a super rich family or group of families, and they just kind of had everything. They were highlighted by the news quite frequently, and a lot of people really disliked them because of the wealth that they had come to claim by being moved away by the government. And it was just kind of a case where a lot of people were bemused by them, a lot of people were curious, and then something tragic started happening. Members started to disappear or to die in horrible ways, and it seemed as though these deaths were occurring not infrequently, quite frequently in fact, and they were just building in frequency, and more people were being targeted. It looked like many of the deaths were attacks and murders rather than sort of accidents. And in fact, some of them later in the book were entirely horrendous ways to die, which were very brutal and nasty. So it turns out that was being targeted by someone or some organisation or something. No one really knew exactly what, but the members were very distraught and worried, of course. And we follow right from the very start, the first few deaths that were reported, and we find out what happened and how people were investigating this. It also kind of happened around the time that the FBI was just getting started, and this was one of the very first cases that the FBI actually worked on and kind of tried to uncover and use their resources and use their new structure and very different structure to regular policing to uncover and work on. So I don't really know anything about the FBI or in fact the Osage clan because I don't live in America, so all of that was very fascinating to me. But in general, I think the book was told really well as well. It's a very suspenseful story, and obviously as events unfold, you can't help but be shocked by the horrific nature of some of it. But for me, I think the most interesting part was definitely learning about the group of people that were being targeted and who was targeting them and why. And I really enjoyed it as a story. It is definitely horrible because it is all based on real life events, and it's completely insane that this many murders happened under people's noses without someone realizing and connecting the dots, and it took so long for them to really kind of narrow it down and put this person or people in jail. But it was absolutely fascinating to read, and if you are not familiar with any of the cases like I wasn't, then I definitely recommend picking this one up. So I ended up giving that one a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars, and I definitely would recommend that one if you're interested in looking for a non-fiction read of that nature. The next one I read is One Child, and this one, as I said, it deals with the one-child policy that was brought in China to essentially ration down the number of babies that were being born in the country in order to reduce the population growth and kind of get to a manageable state where they would become a first world country instead of a third world country and kind of become more of a power in the overall world structure. The idea was that they needed to reduce population sizes in order to basically feed and clothe everyone in the economy, but it turns out that this one baby drive or one child policy was not really a great idea long term, and there's a lot of effects that happened because of it, which Mei Fong kind of discusses in this book. She's actually a reporter in China at the time. She is someone who kind of is quite familiar with a lot of the cases of people being forced to give up babies, to get abortions, to have people adopted out of the country. There's a lot that went on in this time where the one-child policy was in place, and it was quite recent that this policy was ended, and this policy was horrific for some people. It was kind of the death of a lot of children for them, or something that was really, really horrendous. A lot of people now today in China will happily accept a one-child family. It's kind of become the norm a little bit, but many people at the time when it was introduced were very opposed to it and didn't want to abide by the rules, didn't see how it was going to help them, had a lot of problems adjusting and needed abortions multiple times, which was very detrimental to many people's health. There was a lot that was wrong with the policy and wasn't really thought out, and this book basically discusses that side of things. So we follow the main character, who is our reporter, as she goes and interviews people about this and kind of gives her perspective, which is very much negatively on the one-child policy. I will not pretend this is a non-biased view. It's very negative towards it, so bear that in mind. But it was interesting because a lot of the points that she highlights and a lot of the points that she talks about were things I'd never considered. I mean, I'd never really thought about the policy that much anyway because it's so far removed from me. But it was fascinating, and it opened up a lot of questions about the economic reliability of this and the social impact of what it meant for families and family dynamics in China. Previously, China had always kind of revered like the large happy family, and when this was introduced, it became very much a political stance, and in order to get behind the political communism, you had to abide by this and you had to endorse it. It would make sense, it would be a great thing, and a lot of people's mindsets were completely changed because of it. So it was fascinating to read this. I found out so much that I didn't know, and I was completely baffled by just what went on and how many things were really terrible that went on. There was a lot to do with the Olympics in there as well that was quite interesting, because many things that you saw on TV were kind of faked in order to make China look better. And I just didn't know any of it, so I found it fascinating, and I gave that one a solid 4 out of 5 stars. And then the final one that I read, and the one that I most recommend out of all of these, although I recommend all of them, is Into Thin Air, which is by John, and it's such a tragic story. This is kind of recapping the events of the 1996 mountain trip up Everest, or hike up Everest, where quite a lot of climbers went up at the same time in order to try and reach the summit, and John was one of these people who was attempting to reach the summit. He was very familiar with mountain climbing, he'd done a lot of it, but he'd never been up Everest before now, and he got a commission with a magazine to go up and write about his experience. So that is what he did, and he did in the end publish his magazine article, but unfortunately this tragic expedition was one of the worst in the mountain's history, and actually many people died over the course of the expedition. Quite a lot of people that he was hiking up with, and then a couple people from other expeditions as well. It was honestly horrendous how many people died on the mountain in a freak storm that happened. So I had not heard anything about this before going into this book. I obviously knew it was going to be sad and that it was tragic because people were telling me that on Twitter when they recommended it to me, and I've heard this put on so many non-fiction lists, so it was really about time that I got to it. But the author's voice as you're reading this is fantastic. He does an excellent job of kind of filling you in on the details and telling you about the setup of the hike, how people got prepared, how people weren't prepared, some of the mishaps that happened, miscommunication, dizziness from the altitude, altitude sickness that struck people. There's a lot that can go wrong when you're hiking up a mountain quite as tall as Everest, especially if you're not using things like canned oxygen. And if you are someone who's a guide or someone who's experienced, it definitely doesn't mean that you are immune. People can still die on Everest every day, and it's absolutely horrendous to hear the story of how so many things could go wrong in some time that was so recent, like 1996 is not that old, and it's just massively scary. It's convinced me I absolutely never ever want to climb up Everest, because I mean, I didn't want to anyway before, admittedly, but now I really don't, because it's absolutely awful. And I think the way he tells the story is fantastic. It's dramatic, but it's not too over-dramatized. And I think it certainly tells the story very accurately, or as accurately as he can remember it, because obviously things get kind of misconstrued or misremembered when you're in such harsh climates. But I think it was a really fascinating story, and one that I think is so worth reading, especially if you are into non-fiction memoirs. This is superb, and I think such a good read. Horrible, but well worth remembering the risks and understanding why things happened as they did. So I gave that one 5 stars. That was a no-brainer for me. It was so good, and I definitely want to read more books by this author now, because I know he's written quite a few others, but this one is certainly a great starting place, and one that I highly recommend out of all the books I've just mentioned, because it was just so personal and so raw, and I couldn't help but love it, even though it was awful. So those are my non-fiction recommendations for Non-Fiction November, which is currently ongoing, and I hope you guys are interested in picking 1 or 2 of them up. Do let me know if you have other non-fiction recommendations for me, because I am always looking for them, and I'm definitely kind of on a bit of a non-fiction kick right now, so I'd love to have any ideas that you guys have, maybe in a similar vein or maybe something totally different. Do let me know. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you very soon in another video. Bye guys!
Thank you for watching my video today. Go pick up a book, then come back and chat with me again.